All right, so this is Bible Geography 2. This is lesson 4, and this class is really going to go through the house of Omri, and we see there the Omri dynasty, and some of you have already commented how much you love that name, the Omri dynasty. The Omri dynasty, as well as the prophets of Elijah and Elisha, and then the rise of the Assyrian Empire. So that's where chapter 10 unfolds for us. So we're starting at the bottom of page 9, and we should all have up to page 14 in our notes. And so here we see the house of Omri. And who was the key king of this family of Omri? He was actually the son of the first. So the Omri dynasty, he was the first king, and then he had sons after him for about a 4-decade period. And who was the most famous of these kings? 1 Kings chapter 16, if you would turn there, please. 1 Kings chapter 16, and his name in verse 30 was Ahab. So that's what you have to know, that Ahab was the key member of this line of kings. It was evil, as it says in 1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 30. Ahab was the Olympic winner. He won the gold medal of evil amongst the kings of Israel. And we will see why.
Pastor, what was that verse again?
1 Kings chapter 16 and verse 30. That it says, Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Now, please take your book and notice at the bottom of page 125, the policies of Omri. And so what were the policies of Omri? At the bottom there, it says there were 3 distinct policies, and these are in your notes, top of page 10. So what, you tell me what goes, okay, so just interact with the notes in the book. So what goes in those blanks there? Okay, so the first one would be Jezebel. So he renewed a close alliance with Phoenicians. Was that different than David or Solomon? Did David have a close alliance with the Phoenicians? Yeah, and they helped with trading and the ships and the things of that nature. But Ahab is going to take that alliance to a different place, because he seals that alliance with a marriage to Jezebel, the Phoenician princess of Tyre. And that is going to lead Ahab and the nation of Israel to do what? What does it say in 1 Kings 16:31? And at the end of the verse, it's a pretty long verse. You don't have to memorize this verse, okay? Okay, Baal worship. But I'm going to show you the verse to memorize. I have a verse for you tonight. Okay, so Baal worship is really imported into Israel primarily through this relationship with Ahab and then Jezebel, because he's going to build a house of Baal there in Samaria, as what it says. Okay, so what's number 2? What's the second policy there? That would be, he sought to maintain peace with Judah. Now, how is that different from what was going on with the kings in Israel before him? How is that different? Remember what was there a constant between Israel and Judah? There were border skirmishes. They were always fighting over the border. And what king hired the Syrians to help him in his battle against Israel? Remember we talked about him last week? That would be King Asa. Asa. He appealed to Ben-Hadad for his border war with the king of Israel. Okay, so he wanted to have peace with Judah. He said, why should we weaken ourselves? So that was a reasonable policy. And then what was the third thing? Number 3, what goes in that blank? The Transjordan. He exercised strength against the Transjordan. In other words, and what were the especially 3 people groups in the Transjordan? In the south, you had Edom. Below Edom, you had Moab, and then central there or above Moab, you had Ammon, the Ammonites. So they He exercised control over them. And we read this verse last week, the first verse of 2 Kings chapter 1. It says Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. But when Ahab was alive, he was strong in that Transjordan area. So those are three aspects. So Omri and the Phoenicians, this alliance was mutually beneficial, but it promoted a militant form of Baal worship into Israel. And this is kind of a repetition here, but then it says, letter C, Omri and Judah. Omri sought peace because of continuous border conflict with Judah weakened both nations. So that's, and I'm just kind of summarizing in your book some of these sections in here. You see where I'm taking, like on page, you see on page 126, you see where it says Omri and Judah? What's the first sentence there? Okay, there you go. And so that's what I put in your notes. What did I put in your notes? Omri sought peace with Judah. See that? I was so original. Okay. So the notes are following your book because we're using the book. We're learning and studying this.
Pastor, what was B again?
B is Baal. And so you might want to mark in your book, thank you, Frida, for asking. On page 126, you see where it says Omri and the Phoenicians? You see the very last sentence there? What does it say? Who could read the last sentence? However, right there. Who's got that? Micah?
However, the alliance introduced a militant Baalism promoted by Jezebel with her husband's support.
Okay. So that's where I'm getting that point right there. That a militant form of Baal worship. That's letter B. Now, Omri's building achievements. That's at the bottom of page 127, going over to 128. So there's something here that I do want you to learn. And it is on page 128, the first complete paragraph. Omri and his son, what did they build there in that first paragraph? What did they build? A new what? A new capital. And so they moved it from 1 Kings chapter 16, 23, and 24. And I don't know why the book says Shemer. Maybe it's some other translation, but the King James says, and also the map says Tirzah, and he built the capital where? Where did he build the capital? 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24. Where did he build the capital? In Samaria. So he made Samaria the capital of Israel. Okay, so here's what I want you to know. I want you to know in Omri's building achievements, there's no blanks here. So you have to write this in. You see letter E in your notes? Omri's building achievements, two of them. One of them is he built Samaria and made it a capital. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 24. The second, and this is very important, in the introduction of Elijah into the national life of Israel, because Ahab promoted this militant form of Baal worship through marrying Jezebel, and they became the great enemies of God and the great enemies of the prophets, right? Ahab and Jezebel. Verse 33 and 34, 1 Kings chapter 16. The second thing I want you to know is Ahab rebuilt Jericho. But notice how he rebuilt it. 1 Kings 16, 33 and 34. Ahab made a grove. Now that was a grove of idolatry and immorality. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that were before him. Why? Because not only did he practice the Jeroboam counterfeit religion, remember Jeroboam counterfeited the Mosaic law, but now he's added even more confusion by infiltrating Baal worship to mix into it. And so now you have this religious pluralism. Whatever you believe is okay. Baal worship, Jeroboam's religion, the Mosaic law, it's all the same. Isn't that what they say today? But it isn't all the same. But notice this verse 34. In his days did Hiel. Where was Hiel from? He was the Hiel, the what? Bethelite. Now, so what I want this class to help you with is when you see Bethelite, you know he's from where? Bethel. And where was Bethel? It was one of what? One of the two worship centers of Jeroboam's false religion. So he didn't mind false religion. He was from Bethel, and he was the contractor, and he built Jericho, and he laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn. He buried his son, child sacrifice, into the foundation of the building. And then it says he set up the gates in his youngest son, Segub. He took his oldest son and his youngest son, offered them as child sacrifices in the rebuilding of the city of Jericho. That was done, I'm convinced, in worship of Baal, to ask Baal's blessing of prosperous rain and good weather so they could have, it was all about material prosperity, Baal worship, and it was all about sexual perversion and pleasure. And so he sacrificed all of that. He sacrificed his son. And that is what people do for Baal worship. I believe that American secularism is very close to Baal worship. But this was a prophecy of who? Who prophesied the curse? Joshua. If you go back to Joshua and chapter 6, verse 26, who can read that verse for us? Joshua. Who's got that verse? Joshua 6:26. Eunice?
And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, Cursed be the man before the Lord, that riseth up and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest son shall he set up the gates.
Wow. And he says, cursed be the man, because he will be doing it not for the true and living God, but for a false God. And I believe that there's a lot tied into this. There's materialism tied into it. Jericho was a border city in Israel. It was a city of trade. Who was a famous man from Jericho who was a chief tax collector? And they collected taxes in cities which were on the major trade routes for people coming and going. Zacchaeus was from Jericho. So Jericho was a key city of trade. What had God done to the city of Jericho? He had destroyed it. And God said, what did he want to remain with that city of Jericho? Keep it there, keep it destroyed. And in that sense, God is saying you don't need to be material traders. You know what Canaanite means? A merchant man. God says he didn't want to have his people, not that it's not saying business is wrong, but he did not want his people to be like the people of the world in the transacting of business, like the business of the world. And so I believe God, in saying that about the rebuilding of Jericho, saying, trust me to prosper you. Don't trust the building of key trade cities for your prosperity. Trust me, I will take care of you. So the rebuilding of the city showed a moving against God, a lack of faith in God, but trusting in the false gods of the people around them, of prosperity, of materialism, of the trading of the world. And so it was done in rebellion against God. It was done in worship of Baal, in dedication to him, this false deity. So this is what Omri did. He made Samaria his capital, and he rebuilt Jericho as a center of Baal worship. So just think of this now. You have Bethel as the center of Jeroboam's false religion, and you have Bethel, center of Jeroboam's false religion, and then you have Jericho, the center of Baal worship. Okay. Omri and Assyria. Assyria would make military expeditions in order to collect, and where's that in your... That would be on page number 129. If you look at your book on page 129, what would they collect? You can put in your notes, tax revenue. So Assyria was starting their threats of Israel, and they would come down and collect annual revenue. So you don't have to know that, though. You don't have to know that. So what I do want you to know from this section is that Ahab was a key member. Of course, and this you already know, he married Jezebel, he maintained peace, but he imported Baal worship, and the two cities he built were Samaria and Jericho. Okay? So let's move on now to Elijah and Elisha, and this is in your notes, in your book, map number 62. And so letter A is Elijah in your notes. Map number 62. Where was Elijah born? He was Elijah, and as it says in chapter 17, verse 1, what does it say of Elijah? He was Elijah the Tishbite. So just like Jesus was Jesus of Nazareth, he was from Tishbe. So can you find Tishbe on your map? 62, page 130. That's just on the east side of the Jordan River, because it says he was of the inhabitants of Gilead. Gilead was on the east side of the Jordan River. Ramoth Gilead, even further east than Tishbe. So do you see Elijah's birthplace there in your map? Okay, you find that. So Elijah, what an amazing prophet. He, in a sense, drops down from the clouds, and all of a sudden he appears from nowhere to stand before the king. We don't know anything about his upbringing, about his birth or his parents or anything. All of a sudden, boom, he's standing before the king and he's saying, no rain, no dew until I say so. That's bold. The rain was bold, but to say no dew, that's even more bold, right? Think of that. So Elijah then fled to a brook, Cherith. I looked for it on your map. It says it's around the Jordan River, but no one knows where that little brook is. I guess it dried up. Sometimes brooks dry up in our lives. We have to move. Isn't that true? So God used who to feed Elijah at the brook Cherith? The ravens, a most unlikely source. But it says in verse 4, I have commanded the ravens to feed thee. What's the last word? There. So we have to be there. When God says, go, we need to go, and we need to be there until he says to move, because God said, get thee there. And so that's where he went, and God took care of him there. But then the ravens, while coming, it says, it came to pass, verse 7, that the brook dried up. So even the famine took its course and influenced Elijah's source of life. We're not unaffected by the famines of this world. But sometimes the brook dries up in life, and it's a sign that God is getting you uncomfortable, and he does want you to move. And here's actually a very good, and I've used this passage to counsel people about moving. Because God has used this passage in my life. When I left the first church that I started in Brooklyn, my text that morning when I told the church I was leaving was from 1 Kings 17, verse 9, where then God moved him from the brook Cherith, and he says, arise and get thee to Zarephath. And no longer will ravens take care of you, but who's going to take care of you there? A widow who's about to die. A widow who's collecting sticks to cook her last supper with her son. And I'm gonna use her. God uses unlikely sources still. But so God moves us along. And God used that passage to move me. So he was born in Tishbe. He was hid in where during Great Famine? In the Brook Cherith. That would be that blank there. Brook Cherith, number 1. And then, of course, and he went then to Zarephath. Find Zarephath. Zarephath is in your book here because it's up in Phoenicia, up where Baal worship was prominent. But isn't this interesting that the same place that Ahab allowed to influence him for evil, Elijah could go and be a light of God's grace in the very same place. So it's nothing evil about the place, so to speak. It's about us being light wherever we are. We can stand for Jesus Christ. We don't have to, we go to those centers of Baal worship, let Baal worship infiltrate us. We can shine the light, because here this woman of Zarephath became a believer in the true God of Abraham, the God of Elijah. Okay, so, and you know this, then of course he confronted the false prophets on where? Mount Carmel. And that's, if you look for that on your map, and it's right north of the Kishon River, and it's right on the shoreline of the Mediterranean there by the Jezreel Valley. That's Mount Carmel. And then he was taken into heaven after crossing the Jordan River near Jericho. So he was taken into heaven at the Jordan River. Now, and we're going to hold on to that. Go to 2 Kings chapter 2, and then also introduce letter B, Elisha here. And we're just hitting some of the geographical points. So we're not obviously doing a whole study on Elijah or Elisha. We're just hitting at some of the geographical points of their life. But Elisha, with Elijah on Elijah's last day, followed him around. Remember that? Now, Elijah knew he had one day to live on earth before he would be taken up into heaven. Did Elisha know it? Did Elisha know Elijah was gone? Did the sons of the prophets know that Elijah was gone? They all knew. How did they know? I don't know. God must have revealed it somehow. But they all seem to know it, because the sons of the prophets say, hey, the Lord's going to take your master from you today. And Elisha says, I know it. Hold your peace. Each of the places. But here's the interesting thing. And there's a really good book on this, by the way, that really focuses on this. It's called, Living on the Edge of Eternity. I wrote it, right? But it's so interesting that on Elijah's last day, where does the Lord send him in verse 2? Where does the Lord send him?
Bethel.
To Bethel. What was Bethel? The center of Jeroboam's false religion. But yet God had a remnant there. God had a remnant in Bethel. And they went to Bethel. Now find Bethel on your map. You see the red arrow. You'll see that. The red arrow is to Bethel. They started in Gilgal. That was their home there in Gilgal. And they went to Bethel. He said, the Lord has sent me to Bethel. And then after he went to Bethel, he says in verse 6, what? Where does the Lord send him? Verse 4. Yeah, the Lord hath sent me to why Jericho? That was the heart of Baal worship. So on Elijah's last day, he's going to these fortresses of false religion and bringing the truth of God's law, fighting the spiritual warfare. And then he says the third time, the Lord hath sent me where? In verse 6, to the Jordan. Now, I have that definitely underlined. This passage is so amazing to me because there are so many repetitions in it, but one of the most significant repetitions is the sense that Elijah, even to the last day of his life, had a sense of God's definite, personal leading in his life. He says it 3 times. The Lord hath sent me. The Lord hath sent me. So throughout the day, even, the Lord hath sent me. The Lord sent you to work this morning. The Lord sent you here tonight. The Lord will send you home after here. So the Lord is leading us each step of the way in our lives. That's the way Elijah lived throughout his ministry up to the last day. God is showing us the last day. We don't see every day of Elijah's life as clearly as we see his last day, but I believe this is how he was living his days. Ministering to the sons of the prophets and training Elisha and mentoring him, and then leaving as they go through the Jordan River. And the opening up of rivers in Scripture is always in the relationship of what? When do rivers open? When did the Red Sea open? When the army was where? Behind, breathing down their neck. The Jordan River in the days of Joshua opened. Where were the armies then? In a sense, they were in front of them. They were going into the battle. But God is the one who can open up the river and give victory from the armies that are breathing down on you. God is the one who will go before you and give you victory in the battles of life that are before you. And here, God opens up the river because there's a spiritual war that Elijah and Elisha is fighting in. Elijah wants Elisha to know that God is with you. He will give you the victory. God is the God of victory. So to go through the Jordan River, and the river opens up for just two people, not for a whole nation, but just two people. And then, of course, God opens up the rivers for just one after Elijah's taken up for Elisha. So anyway, that's beautiful stuff. So number one is he served the sons of the prophets where? In Jericho and Bethel. And then we see he raised the Shunammite. And let me just say this too, in 2 Kings 2, so Elijah, he goes from Bethel to Jericho to Jordan, right? He goes up into heaven. Elisha is left. Now he's on the other side of Jordan. What does Elisha do? He goes back through the Jordan River with the mantle he strikes. Where's the God of Elijah? And where does he go then? He goes to Jericho, back to Jericho. Elijah trained him this way, and back to Bethel. So he was going to take over Elijah's ministry. All right. So he raises the Shunammite son in Shunem, and that's in our notes. That's in our map, I should say. Page, do you see it right above Jezreel? Elisha raises. Then page 11, he purified the pot of stew in Gilgal. And that's where basically home base was, in Gilgal. And that's also noted in the map. And that's at the top of page 11. He purified the pot of stew in Gilgal. And then look in 2 Kings chapter 9. And here he initiates the purging of Omri's dynasty by sending a prophet where? To anoint King Jehu. Where does he send the prophet? 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 1. What does it say there? Okay, to Ramoth Gilead. Do you see that on the map? Even further east than Tishbe. And that there's a separate map on page, across the page, on page 131, map number 63, where we see Ramoth Gilead. And then Jehu is anointed king, and then he goes and he kills some kings and destroys Baal worship out of the land as well. But Jehu destroyed the Baal worship, but he still followed in the sins of Jeroboam. Okay, so just a little bit about that.
Pastor, did you see that Elijah is from first he went to Bethel, Jericho, then Jordan, right?
Yes.
Or Jericho, Bethel, then Jordan.
He went first to Bethel, and then Jericho, and then Jordan. Because Jericho is closest to the Jordan River, too. It's like. Okay, so Elijah, he went from the brook Cherith. You should put somewhere Zarephath, Mount Carmel, and he was taken into heaven without dying after crossing the Jordan River. And then Elisha continued the ministry by going to the cities of Jericho, Bethel, preaching to the sons of the prophets to stand against all of the idolatry, Baal worship, false worship of Jeroboam in the land. But things were getting worse. Okay? All right, so Ramoth Gilead. All right, let's talk about the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this is on page 131. And letter A, Assyrian military objectives. What were they? Where's the clicker? Where is it? Military objectives on the second column there. You see where it says on like the next to last paragraph down, the Assyrian kings pursued 3 military objectives. And what were they? Okay, to establish a security zone. So actually before that, you can put Assyria was sandwiched between, now look at your map, which we're at map 64. So you might want to just flip the page real quick. And here's the map as well up on the screen. Now we're talking not about Syria. Syria was in this area of, here's Aleppo here, and Damascus down in this area. So we're talking about the Assyrian Empire. And remember Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. So here's Assyria. Here's the first capital that we talked about. I think we mentioned Kala. And then here's Nineveh. Nineveh's more well known to us. And then south of Assyria is Babylon. And then east of Babylon here, and even Susa. We're familiar with Susa in the Bible. Who was in Susa? Wasn't Esther and so forth? That was Persia. So here's the Persian Empire down here. So the 3 great empires, first the Assyrian Empire, they will be taken by Babylon, and then Babylon will be defeated by Persia. Okay, so that's how all this fits in together. Now, Syria was never a world empire in that way. But in this region then, the great empires in the scripture, of course, first was Egypt, and then even Israel, you could say during the days of Solomon, and then Assyria, Babylon, Persia. Okay, so it's good for us to just look at the map here and get a little sense of that. All right. So Assyrian military objectives. Assyria was sandwiched between who? Syria to the north and to the west, and Babylon to the south and the east. So they needed to establish and the blank there is security zone protecting their heartland. And to gain and maintain control over vital trade routes. So that is there from column 2, page 131. You should mark that. Now, and just very quickly, we don't really have to know much about these 2 kings that are mentioned on page 132 because they're not mentioned in the Bible, but they are a part of the history. And if you've heard and I know you've heard messages on Jonah, what's always preached about Jonah? That Jonah went to Nineveh, and Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And what kind of a kingdom was it? It was very what? It was very, very brutal. I mean, heinously brutal, like the terrorists that we hear even about today. And so we see a taste of that through, I'm not even sure how to say this guy's name. Ash. I need Douglas to help me with that. He said the name so amazing yesterday at church. Ashur Nasrupal. I don't know. I'm not going to say that right. Ashur Nasi Ripal. Whatever. You see it. You say it the way you want. So he campaigned employing brutal tactics. That's the blank. And he established Kala, not Nineveh, but Kala, which is Nimrud, named after Nimrod, on a massive scale, complete with a personal palace. Okay? So if you look on that map and look at the green arrows, that's this guy, Ashur Nasrupal. Where coming out of Kala, that was his capital, and strengthening and enlarging his kingdom. After him is Shalmaneser III. He continued his father's expansion. He battled Ahab, and he is the red arrows all around, very similar. You don't have to know the difference between the green arrows and the red arrows. Okay, aren't I so gracious about that? Okay. What is significant, though, is that after them, what does your book say on the next page? What's the next headline of the rise of the Assyrian Empire? There's what? A decline. So what happened during this period of decline in Assyria? During this period of Assyrian decline, Israel and Judah enjoyed a lengthy period of prosperity and peace. Both Jeroboam II in Israel, who reigned 41 years, and Uzziah in Judah, who reigned 52 years, long reigns, long kingdoms. And it brought stability and prosperity at the same time. Who preached during this season? Jonah. That's when he went to Nineveh, when Assyria was down. Maybe they were ready to hear. And God raised up Amos. And why did Amos preach such things like Amos chapter, if you look, go to Amos chapter 4. Amos was a prophet to the northern kingdom. And look in Amos chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. See if we can put some of this together as we're considering the geography of the land and the worship centers in Bethel and Dan, and because of the decline of the Assyrian Empire, and it allowed Israel to have more prosperity and stability, the long reigns of Jeroboam. And so, Bailey, could you read verse 14 and 15, please? Amos chapter 3.
But in the day that I shall visit the transgressions of Israel upon him, I will also visit the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. And I will smite the winter house with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have a king, saith the Lord.
So the people were using their season of prosperity and stability to do what? Live it up. Build more houses, summer houses, just do vacations, have multiple homes, vacation houses, and so forth, rather than to seek God. So let's consider then Jeroboam, king of Israel. Jonah, number one, prophesied during this time and prophesied that the border would be restored, should be restored with a D there, to the north from Hamath. So let's look at that verse. Here's a very specific prophecy of God's mercy through the prophet Jonah in 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 25. And let's, in conjunction with this, look at map number 65. Map number 65 in your book. And who has that verse for us? Who has that verse? 2 Kings 14:25. Yes, Frida?
He restored the coast of Israel from the entering of Hamath unto the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord God of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, which was of Gath-hepher.
Okay, so this is during the reign of Jeroboam. And that's in verse 23. Jeroboam, the son of Joash, began. Now, this is Jeroboam the second. The first Jeroboam was the first king of the northern kingdom. This is the second Jeroboam. And that's also why sometimes it gets a little confusing reading the Kings. Because you're like, I thought Jeroboam was already. Is this? No, this is a different Jeroboam. And this is why I love this chart on page number 117. This is a great reference. This book is a wonderful reference for you. This heavy book. You will love to carry it around because it has so much helpful information in it. So look at this wonderful chart on page 117 that you will have in your possession for the rest of your life. And you will never forget that you will know exactly where to go to see all the kings of Israel and all the kings of Judah side by side with the dates they reigned. Isn't this wonderful? Incredible. So, okay, that's enough of that.
I will not dissect
Yeah,
my
yeah.
book.
Okay. So who was the first king of Israel?
Jeroboam.
Jeroboam the first. Now go all the way down, and you see the Omrides. You see that? And now how many, okay, let me ask you this. From this chart, how many families of kings were there in Israel? Based on that chart. There were none. And you see how it got toward the end. It was only like Hoshea he was the only one of that family, and Pekahiah, Menahem. So anyway, so the first one was Jeroboam. Then who were the kings of the Omrides? Omri, Ahab, Ahaziah, Jehoram. Then Jehu was raised up. Where was Jehu anointed? To defeat? He was anointed to basically bring judgment against the house of Omri. So at Ramoth Gilead. And so then Jehu became a king. So Jeroboam was a king of the family of Jehu. This is really helpful. Wonderful. Yeah.
Was Jehu the one who's left-handed?
No. That's a judge. The left-handed. That was Ehud. Okay, so there you go. So Jeroboam the second. The point is that Jonah preached, and look at the map now. Now look at the map. What map was that we said was 65? And look at the black line. And he said Israel was going to recover its border. Again, you might just read that in Kings and you don't even know where Hamath is. Doesn't mean anything. But you get a map out and you say, wow. Okay? You say, whoa, look at that. You see something. What do you see there? What did Jonah prophesy? That they were gonna basically strengthen their nation all the way to the north to where? Above where? Above Syria. All the way to Hamath. So that's a very merciful prophecy of God through the prophet Jonah. Restore the coast of Israel. Restore the coast of Israel. That was the promise of God. Now,
Yeah.
also,
And that has not happened yet. Is that true?
it was prophesied here, and then it happened.
Oh, it didn't.
Yeah, he restored. He did it according to the prophecy. So it had been done, but Jonah had prophesied that. Now, also, you know what's also cool about this map on page 65? Tell me what's really cool. It will help you understand. The next time you read the book of Amos, you should mark in your Bible somewhere. Say, when you read the book of Amos, go to map 65. Why? You see the little white boxes throughout the map? You see, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. What's up? What's up with Amos there? So if you read in Amos chapter 1 and 2, he says for the sins and then for the sins. And then he prophesies. Think of this. He prophesies to each of these areas, to Edom, to Moab, to Ammon, up here into Damascus, to Tyre. In other words, God is the God, not just of Israel, not just of one people, but he's the God of all the nations. And he's showing that even through the minor prophets ministry. So this is really good too. It gives you a sense of where Amos was preaching to as a prophet to Israel. Isn't that cool? Come on now. Okay, this is so exciting. But we have to stop. So we'll continue in 2 weeks. No class next week. Enjoy yourself. God bless you.